to keep going on. So let's talk about introductions. Your thesis in modern should be one sentence. I know in English you can kind of drag it out, and you might take up to 2 to 3 sentences to fill the whole thing. But for modern history, you really want your thesis to be one sentence. And I only say that because if you can get it into one sentence, it's even easier to link back to it in your paragraphs, and you don't have to rewrite and kind of explain it and try to like get there. You want a really straightforward response that just gets straight to the point. You want to use really clear and strong language, because all of your essays are basically a judgment in regards to the question. And if it does say to what extent, say the extent. Say what extent. Don't just say it's true. Say it's true to a significant extent. It's true to a limited extent. And that's where that strong language and just the clarity in your language is so, so important. Then you want an explanation, which is a clear and brief outline of the context of your judgment and why you reached it. And I've got it, again, what I always do in my lectures, it's so great to see this and be like, okay, I can do that, I can do that, I can do that. But sometimes it feels a bit overwhelming just seeing like the instructions and not seeing it in practice. So what I've done on the next slide, and what I've done for the body paragraphs and the conclusions as well, so you guys can see, is what that actually looks like in an essay. Because again, reading the instruction and seeing it in a physical copy, I think that made such a difference for me, because I would look at a lot of stuff online, but it was only when I saw exemplars and samples that I was able to be like, oh, so that's how you do that. And personally for me, I just had to see it done, and I was like that with my other subjects too, especially in English. I exposed myself to more and more exemplars and people's past essays just to kind of see what everyone else was doing and then make my own style out of it. Then you want an outline of the essay where you're giving and you're listing what each paragraph is going to be about. And this is where you can make it really clear whether you're doing a thematic, factor, event, or a syllabus essay, which are the ones that we just looked at. And then you've got your thesis restated. So to explain that, here we go. So we've got that same question where Vladimir Lenin was a highly critical factor to the Bolshevik consolidation of power. If you guys are doing Russia and you're not feeling the best with consolidation of power, you can 100% use this and use some of the examples that we're using. And I've got a full body paragraph on this as well to add to your notes if you like, if anyone's doing Russia and they need to add anything. Then your second couple of lines, 2 to 3 sentences, is just really explaining that judgment and how you got there and why you're making that argument of highly critical instead of limited. And it's just kind of proving that. And then you're going to say, this is my judgment. This is why I believe it. This is proof of why I'm right. And that's where you talk about the outline of the essay. And your essay should be just points that prove your thesis. And then you're just going to restate your thesis and make sure that you're using that judgment and really having that clear language. And yeah, this is a band 6 modern history intro. So you guys can take a screenshot if you like. Again, the slides will be able to be downloaded. So up to you guys. But this is just, I think seeing something like this can just really help you understand that it's very kind of like a formula, and it's very much like English, where start with your thesis, kind of build into it. You talk about like what the essay is going to talk about. In English, you talk about your themes. Here, you're talking about whether you're doing a thematic essay or the events or your paragraphs, and then you're just going to restate your thesis. Very, very similar to an English essay. Then we get on to the body paragraphs. So your body paragraphs, first you want to start with the judgment on the relationship of your thesis to the focus of your paragraph. So if you were saying that Lenin was highly critical, then you're going to link that to the focus of your paragraph, which might be the military leadership, and then make that link between the two so that you're linking that judgment and your thesis to the specific paragraph point, which is your evidence. Your judgment needs to support your initial thesis, and you want to use similar language so you don't confuse your lazy markers. Like, you don't want to like go back and forth. If you made that thesis in the intro, just stick to it, and you don't want to bring up new ideas. Now, you want to explain that judgment in 1 to 2 sentences, which is just really outlining the argument. This is where you'd put just some context and start to build into it. Obviously, you're not going to jump into a historian quote like in the second sentence of your body paragraph, but you do that after these first kind of 3 sentences. So have a couple, and again, it's exactly the same as English, where in English, you're not going to have like your topic sentence. It's teal. It's like, this is literally teal, guys, but except we can call it geal, because it's judgment, explanation, your examples and your evidence, and then your link back to the judgment. So let's just call it geal for the sake of this lecture. I've never thought of it that way, but it actually works out really well. Because in English, you're not going to go on and you're not going to, the second sentence after you've put your topic sentence is going to be a quote and be like, this is evident in the quote. You're going to explain that judgment a bit and explain that topic sentence a bit. And it's exactly the same in modern. So you'll take that judgment, you'll explain it a bit, 2 to 3 sentences, 1 to 2, it's up to you how many you want to do, but then get straight into your explanation and your examples. And just like in English, how your evidence is your quotes, your evidence is your historian quotes, your evidence is your historical details, your statistics, any percentages. It's also any terminology, any official titles, any legislation, all of that is your evidence. And then you're going to link that back to the judgment. But an example of that is here. So let's have a look. So we've got the judgment. Straight away, we're already bringing up stats by the 4th to 5th sentence. But it's not coming up too early, because how weird if I said the events surrounding the Vietnam War demonstrates the changed course of Cold War in 1970s, temporarily improving relations. For the US, the US was spending 100 million on Vietnam. It doesn't make sense to jump on that. It makes more sense to kind of build into it, and that's where you can have the 1 to 2 sentences. At most, I'd say 3 for some other topics, and I think 3 just gives you a bit more flexibility to jump into it instead of just like going straight into quotes. You kind of want it to flow and have that like just flow on effect, that you've set your judgment, you've kind of like painted the picture of what's happening, and now here's your evidence. But this is a really good example of that. Now it's got different types of details. So we've got, by 1972, the US was spending $100 million on Vietnam. This $100 million on Vietnam, that fact there and that like detail is the same as using historian quotes. So I used to think, oh, historian quotes, I just need to write about as many historian quotes as possible. And yes, write about them where possible, but historian quotes are of the same value as details like this, numbers, as stats, as the 3,000 bombs that were being dropped daily, like this, the 60% statistic that it's got here. And then throughout it, it's also got this Gaddis quote, which was from a historian, and it's also got this Bastien quote from a historian. So it's going back and forth with details, and it's also going back and forth with statistics and historian quotes. And you can see how that is a lot stronger than just saying, for example, this historian proved this, and then this historian also said this. Oh, by the way, this historian said this too. It's really going back and forth and mixing up that detail, and that's going to show you a marker that you have more knowledge and just more of a scope on the topic, and that you're not limiting yourself to just one form of evidence. You're using all different ones. So just like in English, how you're not going to use the same technique for every single quote, you don't want to use the same form of evidence every single time. You can kind of switch it up, and you can understand how that can make your writing a lot nicer. In terms of when you are memorizing stats and numbers, these numbers are good. Like $100 million in Vietnam is an easy number to remember. But when you get to like really random numbers, like this says around 3,000 bombs being dropped daily, you don't have to memorize 3,621, for example. You could just say like around. If you're like, great if you want to memorize it word for word, but it's just not necessary. And I think historian quotes, again, they don't have to be these super long ones. They're just kind of they can even be paraphrased if you like. But this one is pretty short. And so is this one. It's no more than a line. I think if you're gonna make it harder for yourself if you're memorizing these like 2 to 3 line historian quotes each, and it's just gonna take longer to write, and it's just not necessary. Get the main point from it and get out of there. Then you're gonna make that link to judgment, and this is your link back. But that is the dual structure. So if you are doing Cold War, I hope this helps, and you can see that. But even if you're not, I hope I just really put this in there just so you can see what a difference it makes when you're mixing up the evidence. Only because I really was under the perception, and I feel like it's like, oh, historian quotes, but mixing up detail just really adds that analysis, and it's what they are wanting for a band 6. Now, for your conclusion, please literally just rewrite your introduction backwards. Please try to finish and make time that you actually write a conclusion in your exam room. If you're running out of time, you're like, you know what, I'm just going to skip the conclusion. If it happens, it happens, and if you really want to get to the short answers, but they will take away marks for not putting in a conclusion, because that's the structure. Now, whether they take away 1 or 2 marks, it's up to the marker, but you can assure, and it's very, very likely that they at least take away 1, because when you think of an essay structure, it's introduction, body, and conclusion. So even if you've written a 20 out of 20 essay, how are you just going to finish and your last line is just your link back to the judgment for one specific paragraph and not a general link of the entire and just kind of conclusive summary of it? That just doesn't make sense. So in the marking center and in trials, it really depends how many marks you could lose. I don't see why it would be anything more than 2 for something like the conclusion, because realistically it is just a couple of lines, 4 to 6 sentences max. But for the structure mark, it is very, very likely that if you don't have a conclusion, you'll lose at least 1 mark. And to write 4 to 6 sentences and nothing new is being brought up, it's literally just writing your introduction backwards and restating your thesis. I don't see why I'm missing it. So that's why I feel like it is not very likely that you guys won't finish your essays, because the way that especially if you sit the paper in order. So the paper is written in that order so that everyone can finish the essays, and that if you don't get to finish the paper, you might miss and not be able to finish your full 12 marker or 10 marker for the last short answer in section 4. But they've put the essays in the middle purposely with the anticipation that everyone finishes them and can write the whole structure. So I know it seems small. It's like, oh, don't worry, like I'll just skip a conclusion, but it's exactly the same in English, where if you don't have a conclusion, they can't really give you that structure mark because the base structure is intro, body, and conclusion. So this is an example conclusion of Soviet foreign policy. So it's got the outline of the essay, and you're kind of using the themes or the factors and events as evidence of the judgment that you're making. Then you're doing an explanation and your thesis restated, and then you're kind of just ending up with your thesis, which for this one, Soviet foreign policy was only partially successful in achieving its aims from 1917 to 1941. And that's a sample conclusion, but again, this one is, I think, 4 lines, 3 lines. Well, this one's 4 lines, but the first sentence is pretty long. So, sorry, this one is 3 lines, but the sentences are pretty long. So it could be 4. But I wouldn't recommend anything more than 6. It's just not necessary. I think 4 is actually very much the goal. 3 you could do, like this is 3, but that first sentence is very, very long. And kind of connecting a lot of things. But yeah, I'd say 4 to 5 at a max 6, but there's no reason that your essay should be going above. And it's just for the sake of your own timing. Like if you can get it done in 4 lines, why do it in 6 lines? Like it's not that you're bringing up anything new. There's nothing new that you're bringing up here. This is literally just summarizing everything that you've already said. Now, we're going to talk about differentiated essays, because sometimes they'll give you to what extent was this specific factor, or to what extent was the new economic policy the most critical to a specific outcome, or the most important. And it's asking what one factor of the entire dot point, which mentions multiple factors, is the most important. So this is when you kind of argue this yes but, and you say yes, it was important, but was it the most important? So for example, we've got down here, it allows you to discuss the NEP in a question. So if it says, to what extent was the Civil War the most important factor to the Bolshevik consolidation of power? You can say it was an important factor. However, sorry, what am I reading? Oh, sorry. If it was a question, to what extent was the Civil War the most important factor to the Bolshevik consolidation of power? You can say it is true to a great extent that it was an important factor. However, other factors such as the new economic policy also contributed to this overall gain of power. And that's just an example. What you would do in this, and what this does do is opens up the opportunity to talk about other dot points and show more knowledge of other dot points. Doesn't mean you need to. You might agree with it, and you might say that yes, Civil War was the most important factor, and you could just write an entire essay on the Civil War. But realistically, the way that the dot point is structured is it has so many other factors, and when you go into the HSC, like no one's really planning like, oh, I can write like a whole essay on Civil War. I don't think I could have done that at the time, but I could have written I could have written an essay on that whole survey altogether, because we had learned about all the different, like the NEP and the treaty, and Civil War and war communism, where we had learned about all of them in different detail and kind of balanced detail. So I would have actually made that argument where I'm saying it is important to a high extent, or it is highly it was highly important, or it is although it is true that the Civil War was an important factor, it was not the most important factor because of the overall contributions of NEP and maybe war communism as well. For example, so this is where you're saying the yes, but. Now this is harder, and this is a harder essay to approach. How likely is it that you're going to get a question that says a specific factor? In trials, I think it's much more likely to come up than it is in HSC, because HSC is broader, and HSC, again, your trials might be written specifically by your schools. Your trials might be independent, they might be a group, but by either way, especially if it's written by your school can make the decision to make every question at a band 6 level and to write a really, really hard trial. And nearly anyone that you will speak to will say that their trials was harder than their HSC. What you need to remember with the HSC is that the HSC is written for the entire state, with acknowledgement that everyone in the state is at different skills and at different levels. So it's going to have some questions that are at a lower band level, and this goes for all of your subjects. If you do any multiple choice in other subjects, some of the multiple choice questions might be a band 2 level, but others will be band 6, because they need to be able to assess everyone to kind of find that average level and the median. So with differentiated essays, the chance of it coming up in your HSC can happen, but it is much more likely, if you were to get this, for it to be in a trial, just because it is one of those more difficult things if your school really does want to challenge you, and especially if they're writing their own. But again, what's important to remember, if this really freaks you out and differentiated essays really freaks you out, you can just agree with it and say it was true to a great extent, and just explain why it was the most important factor, and you don't have to necessarily have separate paragraphs on the other ones. But again, in Russia and in your section 3, they're going to give you a choice between 2 questions. So let's say this was the question. I very, very doubt it would be very, very mean, and I have never seen it personally in any trial or any HSC paper that I've seen. I've never seen where they've given 2 questions that are differentiated essay questions, where they're very, very specific, and they're saying to what extent has this specific factor been the most critical to a specific outcome. I've never seen that. I've seen one where there's one differentiated essay question where it really suits that, and the other question is more suited just towards like a general essay, talking in threes. Completely up to you. If you are writing differentiated essays already, I definitely recommend using the structure. I think for certain questions, especially like this one's, it's going to work really, really well. And it is always going to show your marker more knowledge of the content and just more scope and more understanding. But there's nothing wrong with writing a thematic or a factored essay either. And differentiated essays are great, but you just have to make sure that your judgment is very clear. So forgetting to address the question is so, so important, especially if you don't address the STEM factor first. So maybe you might actually say that the Civil War was the least important because the new economic policy was more important. But even if you were to make that argument, you'd still want to talk about the Civil War in your first paragraph and explain why it was the least important, because that's what's in the question. And I lost marks on my internal because we got a question for Russia, something similar to this. And because I was saying, oh no, it wasn't actually that important, this factor was more important, I started with the other factor and I was talking about that, and then I didn't bring up the actual question until my last paragraph, and that's when I was talking about the one that I disagreed with and how it was like true to a limited extent. But in doing that, I didn't actually answer the question, because the question was asking me about this specific point. So you can address the STEM factor first, and even if you're saying that it's the least important out of 3 or it's only partially important, still address it first, because that's the question, and that's the way that they get really easy to screw up, and why it's a bit of a risk if you don't feel confident with it. If you feel confident with it and you've been doing it all year, 100% do it. It is such a strength and is such a gain. But if you not really sure on it, and if this kind of like freaks you out, it's so valid, because it is easy to screw up. Just make sure that you address the question, and the easiest way to address the question is writing your first paragraph. Rule of thumb, every single time if you're doing a differentiated essay and you're saying yes, it's true, but there were also others, your first paragraph has to be on the factor that they've given you in the question. 100%. Then you can talk about the others. Whether you say that was an important factor, whether you think it was the least important, it has to be the first paragraph, because it's just showing that you're answering the question, and then you can go on to your counter argument. Now, you also don't want to sit too much on the offense. You still do need to make an overall judgment on the overall impact. So it's still a judgment to say that they all contributed to it. But you don't want to sit too much on the fence, and you can still have that judgment where one contributed much more. And then failing to link the factors, it's not necessarily a screw up, but it is harder to get in that 24 to 25 mark category, because by linking the factors and saying, well, therefore through this you can see that the NEP was more important than the Civil War, you're just really aligning in your paragraphs, and they're all really reconnecting. But these issues are really easy to fix, and if you do, you're headed in a direction of a very sophisticated essays, and a lot of Band 6 essays are written as differentiated essays. Don't get me wrong, there's thematic essays and factor essays that will still get Band 6s and can still get those marks, but a lot of Band 6 essays are written as differentiated essays just because it's a bit more of a complex structure to use. But I don't like talking about that and saying that too much because I don't want anyone to think, oh no, like, should I not do a thematic essay? I still did a thematic essay in my trials. I knew how to write differentiated essays, but I knew that I was only going to go to it if I got one of those questions that was really specific. And it's like, is this like analyze or assess the extent to which this is the most specific? And I didn't get one of those questions. So I was like, you know what, I'm going to do a thematic one. And I still got that same mark range for my essay. So for differentiated essays, just make sure you're consistently addressing the question. Your first paragraph, and for reference, it should be slightly larger than the rest of the paragraphs only because it is the STEM factor and they're asking about it. So for example, if the question asks you to argue that NEP was the most important factor of Bolshevik consolidation of power, your first paragraph has to be on NEP. Even if you're disagreeing with that statement, it has to be on it. And you want that first paragraph to be a little bit longer than the others because in the end, that's the question. Whether you're agreeing with it or disagreeing with it, that's the question. Even in paragraphs where you're focusing on the other paragraph, you want to make sure that the beginning and the end of your judgment is mentioning that STEM factor. So, for example, your topic sentence for another paragraph would be, similarly to the new economic policy, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was also highly important to the Bolshevik consolidation of power. So even though it's a completely separate paragraph and you're looking at a separate kind of factor, you're still linking it back to the question because the question hasn't told you what the other factors are. You've made the decision to write the differentiated essay, so you need to make sure you're still going back to the NEP and you're still going back to that STEM factor, which is whatever the factor they've asked you in the question. They'll specify one if they do it. So that's probably one of the biggest mistakes people make in differentiated essays, and that's a mistake that I know that I made and I learned the hard way in my internal, because I was like, no, I'm not doing this, I'm going to say the others are more important, and it's going to sound so smart because, like, look, I'm not agreeing with the question, I'm actually saying there's others, but I messed it up because I didn't keep linking it back, and I talked about my other factors before I mentioned the actual question. So realistically, I didn't bring up the question until my third paragraph. So you can imagine how I wasn't going to get the best mark for that. And just make sure you're making a clear judgment. And this is an example of a clear judgment where you're not necessarily sitting on the fence, but you're just acknowledging that they're all kind of important and they're together, or, and usually that will be the case. Sometimes you can have a different judgment. And it really depends what point you're arguing, but usually it'll be the case that they're all highly important, and it's not necessarily that there was just one, it was the combination of three. And if you can link the factors together, do it, because this is how you can really grab and kind of steal into 24 out of 25 territory, and that's where you can find a common thread or common feature amongst them all, that can really set you up for a highly sophisticated argument. And instead of just saying that one is important but also saying the others too, you can instead say the NEP was a highly critical factor within the Bolshevik consolidation of power, as it, like many other factors, enabled the Bolsheviks to maintain popular support. These other factors include, and then bring up your other topics, or for example bring up the treaty or whatever you're going to talk about in that case. But I hope that makes sense for differentiated essays. This might actually be the first time any of you have heard of a differentiated essay. It depends if your teacher has taught it to you. It depends if you've ever read one before. You might have even written one and just not known that it was a differentiated essay and just thought, oh no, I'm disagreeing with the question. But it's completely fine if you hadn't. And I had some friends who hadn't been just kind of made aware of this structure up until trials. So don't feel bad if you're at that point, and don't let this overwhelm you. I know it's very different. I know thematic essays and factor essays, I love them. I am an English history gal, so you best believe I love factor and thematic essays. And for me, they're just a lot clearer, and I felt just a lot safer doing them. But differentiated essays are really, really strong. And if you are really aiming for those really high categories, and really hitting that 24 to 25 differentiated essays done well, are the way to go. But in saying that, it is very easy to screw them up. So you can still definitely hit that 24 to 25 mark territory in a very, very good thematic or factored essay. So this is an example of a differentiated essay, because I feel like saying all that is fine, but like let's talk about it in actual introduction, which is where you're really going to be able to show that differentiation. So let's say, to what extent was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk a critical factor in the Bolshevik consolidation of power? You might see this and be like, it was the most important, and your whole essay is just on the treaty, which again, completely fine. And then you can write a thematic essay about the different influences within the treaty and how that all contributed to Bolshevik consolidation of power. And by that, you can still write a thematic or a factored essay. But if you wanted to do a differentiation and you wanted to say that there were other critical factors as well, then you can do a differentiated essay. So you can say the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a highly critical factor in the Bolshevik consolidation of power, where you've still got that judgment, and then you're doing that differentiation. So when you bring up that differentiation, you want to say something like however, or then although, and one of those contrasting sentences. So then you can say, however, the importance of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk must be considered as just one in a series of critical factors, all of which were undercut by two central aims: maintaining popular support and implementing directly or creating the conditions for socialism. So then you put an explanation. So the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was essential to the consolidation, as it allowed Russia to exit World War I, an increasingly unpopular conflict which Russia was ill-equipped to sustain, and by consequence focus on domestic issues in regards to their central aim. And then saying the significance of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was enhanced by the similar aims for the Bolsheviks in regards to implementation of early social and political reforms, the civil war and war communism, along with new economic policy, all of which demonstrate the interrelated importance between all factors contributing to consolidation. So I'm sure you can see here, in comparison to a thematic or a factored essay, there's definitely more to do. But that's only because you really do, and that extra step that you're taking is really just that differentiation where you're saying, yes, it was important. But this is, and whenever I did write differentiated essays, I always tried to go along this route. I think you can disagree with it and you can say, oh no, this is actually the least important. The others are heaps more important. But I think you're pretty safe. And just to make sure your paragraphs are pretty good lengths and balanced, it's just a kind of balanced out essay, is saying that yes, it was an important one, but all of these together all contributed to it, and it wasn't just that, and it's not fair to just kind of claim that to be the one. So it has to be clear and assertive, and you are making an argument. So even in a differentiated judgment, it's still making a specific case, and your case is, yes, it was important, but there were other ones that were important too. That doesn't take away from the importance, but it's saying that it wasn't the most, because altogether they came together. And you want to keep it simple for your sake, but also for your marker's sake. A lot of people think the more sophisticated it is, the more complicated it's going to be, but it's not true. You want it to make sense to you, and I feel like with differentiated essays, it can get really confusing to write, because if your language isn't clear and if your judgment isn't clear, and if you just haven't sat with your thesis for a bit and you really understand it, your argument is very hard to carry out. The questions you get tend to follow these lines. So how did blah blah affect this? How successful was this? How significant was this in relation to this? How did blah blah change? Why did blah blah happen? So these are some examples. And these questions don't a lot of the time leave room for you to sit on the fence. So you do have to decide on an argument. These are some examples of arguments that you can make. And I just put these in so if anybody's downloading the slides, you can come back to them. Some common judgment phrases, and I really, really recommend noting this down. I think this slide plus the reliability slides that we were looking at are some of the most important ones of this entire lecture. But to a large extent, to a limited extent, highly successful, crucial, significant, only partially, of paramount importance, the view that blah blah is highly accurate in regards to blah blah can be accounted by this ideology, this event, for example. This is so important, and this just for your language, and those judgment phrases, no matter what, your thesis will include some interpretation of this. If not word for word, it will have these words, but it will have some type of form of these words, because every essay is going to make a judgment. And just make sure, please, if you're going to take one thing from this lecture, let it be that your essay is not retelling the content. Now, I know it's so easy, and sometimes I feel like, especially in history, because all we're learning in class is the story and the content, and you're learning like the events in the way that they happened. We don't always necessarily get that much practice in the analysis and in making a judgment, but this essay is being marked by past HSC teachers who have taught the content. So you don't have to teach them the content, you don't have to tell them the story. And it's very easy in modern history to fall into like the narrative where you're just kind of telling the story and you're not analyzing or making any judgment. And the only way to get away from that is by using words like this and by having that opinion or that judgment. So that's why I really recommend this slide. Now, what I was saying before is that there's different evidence, there's different types of evidence. So just like a historian quotes evidence, so are statistics, so is terminology. So if you were to use a German term opposed to the English translation, but even better, and if you remember from before, is to use the German term and then the English translation together. But that's a form of detail. Official and full titles, primary sources like newspaper articles, speeches, letters, or diaries, and also historian quotes and paraphrases. So don't think that like you can use a primary source from a newspaper at a time, or you can use a speech from like a line from one of Hitler's speeches, or something that Stalin said, like a quote from them. Those primary sources are so strong too. So don't think you just have to straight go to historians all the time. There are other things that you can include, and then obviously just more obscure facts or like not obvious content or just something different. But I really recommend switching up between primary sources, historians, and statistics particularly. But drawing in terminology is always going to do well. It's always going to get brownie points as well. So this is just a bit of an example of the different details. So terminology is here. We've got the Revolutionary Guard. So it's got the English translation, but then the Russian translation for the Russian National Study. Here we've got statistics, and you can see how great that looks. We've got the Peace, Bread, and Land, which is such an easy quote and slogan as a primary source. If you were doing Russia, please look into this if you don't already use it. I feel like a lot of people are. But this all power to the Soviets and peace, bread, and land is such a good quote and just so easy to memorize. We've also got this primary source. And then we've got a historian, and everybody, I'm sure if you're doing Russia, you're very aware of Fitzpatrick, and a quote from there, or even just using the official full titles like the Commissar of War, or Trotsky's title, Stalin's title before the power struggle, and just the different, especially Stalin, because they all had like so many different roles in the party. Using that is just like using a statistic, because it is official and it's full titles, and it's just like terminology, and it's kind of the terminology of the text. So mixing those up and having a mix of these, I hope you can see, I know I'm sounding really repetitive, but I hope you can see how using a mix of these is going to sound even better than just using historian quotes every time, especially mixing historian primary sources. But I think it gets really wordy, and I think it's nice to break up your essay, and the best, I feel like, evidence a lot of the time to really show the proof a lot of the time is coming in statistics and showing the differences in statistics and how much things grew or how much they decreased, for example.